When my wife passed away last spring, I thought the hardest chapter of my life had already been written. Then her estate lawyer called me on a Tuesday morning and said something that stopped me cold. "Harold, I need you to come to my office today. Come alone. Don't tell your daughter. What I'm about to show you cannot wait." I almost dismissed it as routine paperwork, something about the will or probate filing, but the way she said it, quiet, careful, like she was choosing every word, told me this was something else entirely. When I walked through her office door 2 hours later and saw what was spread across her desk, I understood that my wife had been trying to protect me from beyond the grave. My name is Harold Mercer. I'm 67 years old, a retired civil engineer, and I've lived in Kingston, Ontario for most of my adult life. Margaret and I bought our house on Barry Street in 1989. We raised 2 children there, painted the front porch 3 times over the decades, planted the same vegetable garden every spring for 30 years. When Margaret died of cancer in March, she took something irreplaceable out of the house and out of me. 41 years of marriage doesn't prepare you for the silence that follows. Our daughter Carolyn was 42. She lived 40 minutes away in Napanee with her husband Derek, a man I'd never fully trusted but tolerated for Margaret's sake. Our son Thomas was 38 and lived in Vancouver. He and Carolyn had never been particularly close, and after Margaret's diagnosis, Thomas had gone quiet in that way some people do when they don't know how to face something painful. He called once a week, but we both knew something had shifted. In the weeks after Margaret's funeral, Carolyn and Derek became fixtures in my life in ways they never had been before. Carolyn would arrive unannounced on weekday mornings, let herself in with the spare key Margaret had given her years ago, and begin reorganizing things. She'd move my medications to different shelves, rearrange the kitchen drawers, ask me 3 times whether I'd remembered to pay a particular bill. When I'd confirm that yes, I had, she'd look at Derek with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Dad, you seem exhausted," she'd say. "You're not sleeping properly. You're forgetting things." "I haven't forgotten anything," I'd tell her. "You forgot about Dr. Alvarez's appointment last week." I hadn't forgotten it. It had been canceled by the clinic due to a scheduling conflict, and they'd left a message on my phone. I played her the voicemail. She looked almost annoyed that I'd found it. These small things accumulated like snow, a slow, quiet accumulation that you don't notice until it's already deep. Derek started asking questions about the house. Casual at first, what did I think property values were doing in Kingston these days? Had I thought about whether a 3-bedroom was too much space for one person? Did I know what the carrying costs amounted to annually? When I pointed out that I'd been managing my own finances since before he was born, he'd smile and say he was only thinking about my future security. Margaret's estate was not small. The house alone was worth just over $900,000. There were 2 RRSP accounts she'd rolled into an RIF after retirement, a modest investment portfolio, and a joint account from which we'd always paid household expenses. My own pension from the provincial government, combined with CPP and OAS, meant I had no financial pressure whatsoever. I wasn't wealthy by Bay Street standards, but I was entirely comfortable and entirely independent, none of which seemed to satisfy Carolyn and Derek's interest in my affairs. 6 weeks after Margaret's funeral, Carolyn called to tell me she'd booked an appointment for me with a Dr. Folds, a geriatric specialist at Kingston General. I told her I hadn't asked for any such appointment. She said my own family doctor had referred me because he was concerned about some signs of cognitive decline he'd noticed at my last physical. I called Dr. Patel's office immediately. His receptionist told me there had been no such referral. When I told Carolyn this, she insisted I must have misunderstood. "Dad, you do this. You hear what you want to hear." I kept the appointment anyway, because I wanted to understand what was happening. Dr. Folds was pleasant but businesslike. He ran me through a series of standard assessments, orientation questions, memory tasks, pattern recognition. At the end, he told me my results were within normal range for my age. Nothing of clinical concern. I drove home feeling relieved, then immediately suspicious about why Carolyn had been so certain something was wrong with me when a specialist had found nothing. That evening, she called to ask how it had gone. I told her everything was fine, completely normal. She paused and said, "Dr. Folds told me he had some concerns he didn't want to alarm you with. I'm going to follow up with him directly." I said nothing, but something hardened in me that night. I started paying attention differently. I began keeping a small notebook, dates, times, incidents. When Carolyn moved my car keys from the hook by the back door and left them on the kitchen counter, I wrote it down. When Derek mentioned, twice in the same conversation, that he knew a financial advisor who specialized in helping seniors simplify their estates, I wrote it down. When Carolyn told our neighbor Patricia within my earshot, but as though I wasn't there, that Dad was having more and more confused days, that they were really worried, I wrote it down. Then came the Tuesday morning call from Sandra Holt. Sandra was Margaret's estate lawyer, but more than that, she'd been Margaret's closest friend from their university days at Queen's. She and Margaret had kept each other's confidences for 40 years. When she called and told me to come alone, I didn't hesitate. Her office on Princess Street was quiet when I arrived. She met me at the door herself, which she never did. She locked it behind us and guided me to her private office at the back of the building, closing that door as well. On her desk was a sealed envelope labeled in Margaret's handwriting, "For Harold, when the time is right. Sandra will know." "She gave me this 14 months ago," Sandra said, her voice carefully controlled. "Before she started chemotherapy, she made me promise to hold it until I was certain you needed it." My hands weren't steady as I broke the seal. What was inside was 22 pages of Margaret's handwriting, supplementary photographs printed on standard paper, and a USB drive. Margaret had always been methodical. 30 years as a school administrator had made her precise about documentation. What she'd assembled was not a letter, it was a file. She had begun to suspect Carolyn in the autumn before her diagnosis. Small amounts missing from a shared savings account she and Carolyn had set up years earlier to manage household emergencies. Carolyn had signing authority. The withdrawals were irregular but consistent, 200 here, 400 there, always just below the threshold that would generate an automatic notification. Over 18 months, just under $11,000, had been withdrawn for purposes Margaret could never account for. She'd confronted Carolyn gently, once, and Carolyn had become tearful and defensive, saying she'd borrowed it intending to pay it back, that she and Derek were under financial pressure from a home renovation that had gone over budget. Margaret had decided to let it go and said nothing more, but she'd watched more carefully after that. When Margaret's cancer diagnosis came, she told Sandra she felt a cold certainty. The word she used was certainty that Carolyn would see her illness as an opportunity. She didn't write it angrily. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, with the careful sorrow of someone who has accepted an unwelcome truth. She had asked Sandra to consult discreetly with a colleague who specialized in elder law. The consultation produced something that chilled me to my core. Based on patterns Margaret had described, the colleague recognized the early architecture of a guardianship strategy. The manufactured evidence of cognitive decline, the isolation of the target from outside relationships, the slow erosion of the target's confidence in their own memory and judgment. The consultations with financial advisors arranged without the target's knowledge or consent. They had been building a case to have me declared legally incapable. Sandra opened her laptop and played me an audio recording from the USB drive. Margaret had installed a small digital recorder in the kitchen, something she'd done without telling anyone, on the advice of Sandra's colleague during a Sunday dinner visit 4 months before she died. Derek's voice was clear and businesslike. He wasn't speaking to Margaret, he was speaking to Carolyn, in the hallway outside the kitchen, not quite far enough from the recorder to escape it. He was describing, with the fluency of someone who had researched the subject carefully, what the Substitute Decisions Act required in Ontario to establish legal guardianship over a person deemed incapable. He mentioned a psychiatrist in Toronto whose reports were, as he put it, thorough and flexible for the right clients. He mentioned that the RRIF alone, once under the estate's control, would be worth liquidating immediately. Then Carolyn's voice, "Mom's not going to be around to make this harder than it needs to be. After that, it's just Dad." I had to ask Sandra to stop the recording. We sat in silence for a moment. Through her window, I could see Princess Street going about its ordinary Tuesday morning, people stopping at the second cup on the corner, a city bus pulling away from the curb. "There's more," Sandra said quietly. On the drive. There were records of online searches conducted from Derek's personal email account, accessed through a shared family tablet Margaret had quietly checked after a visit. Searches for how to contest a will in Ontario, searches for power of attorney abuse Canada, searches for guardianship application process Ontario, and the one that took my breath away, searches for what happens to RIF after death without named beneficiary. Margaret had changed her RRIF beneficiary designation to a charitable foundation 2 months before she died, quietly, without telling anyone. She had anticipated this. She had also written something in the final pages of her letter that I've read so many times since that I know it by heart. "I want you to understand that I am not angry at Carolyn. I am heartbroken. I raised her with every good thing I had to give. Whatever she has become, it wasn't for lack of love, but I will not let her harm you. I spent 41 years making a life with you, Harold. I will not let the last thing I do be leaving you undefended. Sandra told me she had already been in contact with a lawyer who specialized in financial elder abuse cases. She had shared the documentation with a contact at the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit. She had also, with my wife's advance blessing recorded in a notarized addendum to the file, taken a quiet precaution of her own. She had contacted Thomas. I hadn't known Thomas was involved. He'd arrived in Kingston the previous evening and was waiting in Sandra's conference room. When Sandra opened that door, I hadn't seen my son in 8 months. He looked older, thinner, like someone carrying weight that hadn't been there before. He crossed the room and put his arms around me without saying anything, and for a moment I couldn't speak either. Mom wrote to me separately, he said finally. 6 weeks before she died. She sent it to my work address so Carolyn wouldn't see it come through the family email. He pulled a chair close to mine. She asked me to stay quiet until Sandra gave the signal. She was worried that if Carolyn suspected I knew, they'd move faster before the evidence was secure. The plan Margaret and Sandra had put in motion was deliberate and careful, which is to say it was entirely Margaret. The OPP financial crimes investigator Sandra had been liaising with had obtained authorization to access the shared family tablets account history and the relevant financial records. Dr. Folds, the geriatric specialist Carolyn had booked for me without my knowledge, had already filed a complaint with his licensing college after Carolyn had contacted him following my appointment and, misrepresenting herself as my healthcare proxy, attempted to obtain a modified assessment report that would be more useful for a guardianship application. He had documentation of that contact and had voluntarily provided it to investigators. Dr. Patel, my own family doctor of 15 years, had not made any referral. He was deeply troubled to learn his name had apparently been invoked to legitimize the appointment. He, too, had been interviewed. The case was further along than I'd realized. But there was one remaining piece. The investigators needed Carolyn and Derek to state their intentions explicitly, on record, in a context where the evidence could not be attributed to entrapment. Sandra had an idea about how to accomplish that. She called Derek that afternoon. She told him, with perfect professional composure, that as executor of Margaret's estate, she needed to review the beneficiary designations on my RIF accounts before finalizing probate, and that there appeared to be a discrepancy requiring clarification. She told him Harold had come in that morning, appeared quite confused about the documents, and that it might be helpful if the family attended a follow-up meeting later that week. She suggested Thursday at 2 o'clock. Derek said that wasn't a problem at all. He sounded pleased. Thomas and I spent 2 nights at Sandra's house. I called Carolyn once, briefly, to tell her I was spending a few days sorting through Margaret's personal belongings with Sandra's help. She seemed satisfied with that. She did not ask how I was. She asked whether I'd had any other appointments recently, whether I was eating properly, whether I was managing the household bills. I told her everything was fine. My voice was steadier than I expected. Thursday came with a gray sky and the smell of rain over the street Lawrence. Thomas sat in Sandra's conference room, out of sight from the main office. A small recording device, legally authorized and witnessed, sat beneath a stack of estate documents on Sandra's desk. Carolyn and Derek arrived 4 minutes early. Carolyn was dressed carefully, the way she dressed for things she considered important. Derek carried a leather notebook, the kind people bring to meetings where they intend to take control. I was already seated when they came in. Carolyn gave me a practiced look of warm concern that I now recognized as entirely performed. Derek shook my hand with the firm, slightly too slow handshake of someone managing an elderly person they've decided requires managing. Sandra guided them through 30 minutes of routine estate documentation before she set down her pen and looked at both of them with the precise, unhurried expression I imagined she'd refined over 30 years of practice. Before we continue, she said, I want to ask you both directly about something. It's come to my attention through a third party that inquiries have been made regarding Harold's legal capacity. I want to understand the family's position on that before we discuss asset distribution. Carolyn glanced at Derek. Something shifted in the room. We're just concerned about Dad's ability to manage complex decisions going forward, Carolyn said. It's not coming from a bad place. We want to make sure there's a proper structure to protect him. What kind of structure? Sandra asked. A power of attorney to start, Derek said, leaning forward slightly, ideally moving toward a formal capacity assessment that would give us the standing to manage his finances and living situation directly. It's what Margaret would have wanted. Harold can't stay in that house indefinitely. I'm sitting right here, I said. Derek gave me a patient smile. Of course you are, Harold, and we want to make sure you're protected. From what? for making decisions that might not be in your best interest. I haven't made any such decisions. Dad. Carolyn's voice shifted into the tone she used when she wanted me to understand I was being unreasonable. Dr. Folds indicated to me that there are areas of concern. Doctor. Folds found nothing of clinical concern, I said. He told me so directly. And when you contacted his office afterward to request a modified report, he declined and filed a complaint with his college. I've read the complaint. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people whose footing has just given way. I don't know what you think you've Derek began. Sandra placed Margaret's file on the desk. I'd like to show you something, she said, and her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who has been waiting a long time to say exactly this. She opened the folder and began laying documents across the desk one by one, the way you set a table, the bank records, the printed screenshots from Derek's search history, the audio transcript from the kitchen recording, the timeline of withdrawals from the shared account. Carolyn's face had gone very still. Derek was staring at the pages with an expression I can only describe as the look of someone watching a building they thought was stable begin to come apart. The recording you're looking at a transcript of was made legally in the family home by the homeowner, Sandra said. The financial records were obtained through proper investigative channels. The search history was accessed from a device registered in Margaret's household during her lifetime. Derek stood up. This is completely... You should sit down, Sandra said. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Then she picked up her phone and pressed a single button. Please come in, she said. The conference room door opened, and Thomas walked through it. I watched my daughter see her brother and understand in a single moment the full shape of what had been assembled against her. Her face cycled through something I don't have language for: shock, then a flash of something like grief, then a hardening that was worse than either. You have been systematically stealing from your mother's estate before she was even gone, Thomas said. His voice was level in the way that takes effort to maintain. You attempted to manufacture evidence of Dad's cognitive decline. You tried to coerce a physician into falsifying a medical report. You consulted with someone about obtaining guardianship of a man who has every one of his faculties and doesn't need or want your protection. He stopped. I want you to tell me something that explains any of that. Carolyn looked at me. For a moment she looked like the person she used to be, the 12-year-old who'd sat with me in the garage on winter Saturday mornings while I worked on old cars, who'd asked me endless questions about how engines worked because she genuinely wanted to know. I held that moment for exactly as long as it lasted, which was not very long. The money from Mom's account, she said finally, was owed to us. We put in years of time and effort into this family that nobody ever acknowledged. That is not what a civil court will determine, Sandra said. Derek sat back down. He looked like a man who was doing rapid calculations and finding none of the numbers favorable. We'd want to speak with a lawyer before anything else happens. That would be appropriate, Sandra said. The OPP Financial Crimes Unit will be in contact with you both directly. I'd recommend engaging counsel before that conversation occurs. They were in Sandra's office for another 40 minutes after that. I said very little. I had already said what I needed to say, and I was aware of a strange stillness inside me that I didn't entirely understand yet. Not peace. Something more like the aftermath of a long storm, the air after, when the pressure has finally broken. When Carolyn stood to leave, she turned to me once more. I thought you were going to need help eventually, she said. I was just getting ahead of it. You were getting ahead of my death, I said. And your mother's, you can tell yourself a different story if you need to. But that's what it was. She didn't answer. Derek held the door for her without looking at me, and then they were gone. What followed was months of the particular exhaustion that comes with legal process. Carolyn and Derek retained separate counsel almost immediately, which Sandra had predicted. The financial fraud charges were laid in June. 3 counts of fraud over $5,000, 1 count of unauthorized use of a credit facility, and 1 count of influencing or attempting to influence a medical professional for the purpose of legal proceedings. Derek faced an additional charge related to his documented attempt to engage a psychiatrist willing to produce a fabricated capacity assessment, a contact the investigators had traced and interviewed. The preliminary hearings were in the fall, in Napanee. I attended 2 of them. Thomas came for both, flying in from Vancouver and staying in the spare room that had been his since childhood. And the 3 of us, Thomas, Sandra, and I, had dinner at the kitchen table, most evenings, in a way that felt, improbably, like something being rebuilt rather than something ending. Carolyn pleaded not guilty. Derek, facing the heavier charges, eventually took a plea arrangement, which his lawyer negotiated down to 2 counts of fraud, and 1 count related to the medical professional contact. At sentencing, he received 3 years, with 18 months to be served in a federal correctional facility and the balance on supervised release. The restitution order covered the full amount taken from Margaret's account, plus legal costs. Carolyn received 22 months, 12 to be served, with 2 years of probation to follow, and a permanent prohibition from acting in any fiduciary capacity. The judge's comments at sentencing were pointed. She said she found it particularly troubling that the scheme had been initiated while the primary victim, Margaret, was still alive and in declining health, and that it reflected a degree of premeditation and callousness that warranted a sentence that went beyond symbolic accountability. I sat in that courtroom and listened and felt something I still don't have a clean word for. It was not satisfaction. It was not grief exactly, though grief was inside it somewhere. It was the feeling of a long pretending finally coming to an end. Thomas helped me go through Margaret's personal items that December. We took our time. He'd found a job in Toronto in the autumn, a structural engineering firm. A good opportunity, so the drive to Kingston was shorter now, and he came most weekends. We'd have breakfast at the Sleepless Goat on Princess Street and walk along the waterfront in the gray winter light, talking about nothing important, which is one of the best things you can do with someone you trust. By February, I had decided to sell the house. Not because of anything dark, not because the memories were too heavy or the rooms felt wrong, partly because 900 square feet of maintained Victorian is simply too much house for one person, and partly because I'd been thinking about the waterfront condominiums being developed near the Confederation Basin. Walking distance to everything, no driveway to clear, a balcony with a view of the Kingston skyline and the lake. I'd spent 40 years in a house. I thought it might be something to try living lighter. Sandra helped me find a buyer by spring. I closed in late April. A cool, clear morning with the smell of the lake coming in from the east, and on the afternoon of the closing I drove to Cataraqui Cemetery and sat for a while near Margaret's grave. I told her what had happened in the months since she'd died. I told her the plan she'd made had worked, that Sandra had held her file with exactly the care she'd trusted her to, that Thomas was close now, and that we were finding our way back to each other. I told her I'd read her letter so many times I could recite it from memory, that I'd kept the last page, the one with the passage about the 41 years in the breast pocket of my coat all winter, like something I needed to carry with me. I moved into the condo in May. My upstairs neighbor was a 70-year-old retired nurse named Frances, who'd moved from Calgary 5 years earlier to be closer to her grandchildren. She knocked on my door 2 days after I moved in with a container of butter tarts, and the information that the building's common room had a book club that met on the second Tuesday of each month, and that she intended to drag me to it whether I wanted to go or not. I went. I didn't hate it. It's late summer now. I drink my morning coffee on the balcony and watch the lake while it's still cool. The boats move quietly out of the marina just before 7 o'clock. The same rhythm every morning, and there's something about that constancy I find useful. Thomas calls on Sunday evenings. Sandra and I have lunch once a month. Not because there's estate business to discuss, but because we've found we enjoy it. In the elder abuse support group I've attended since the fall, I've met people whose stories run a narrower track than mine did, who lost everything before anyone intervened, who had no Sandra, no documented file, no wife careful and loved enough to prepare a defense before she left. I go because their stories matter, and because showing up is something I can do, but also because it reminds me, every time, of a thing I came to understand slowly, over the course of that terrible year. The people most capable of deceiving you are the ones who know how you love, who have watched you long enough to know exactly where the soft places are, what words disarm you, which fears you're most susceptible to. Carolyn didn't invent her method from nothing. She understood her father. She knew I trusted family above instinct, that I would doubt my own memory before I doubted my daughter, that my desire to keep the peace would work against me almost every time. What I know now that I didn't know then is that love is not the same as access, that wanting to believe the best of someone is not the same as ignoring what they show you, that you can grieve the loss of who someone was to you while also being clear-eyed about who they've become. Margaret knew this. She spent the last year of her life in pain and fear and with a kind of quiet ferocity, building me something to come home to. I don't have language adequate to what that cost her, or what it means to me. I keep her file in the bottom drawer of my desk. I don't read it often anymore. But I keep it because it is, among other things, a record of what love looks like when it's paying attention. If you're watching this from somewhere in Canada and what I've described feels familiar, the rearranged belongings, the appointments you didn't ask for, the steady drip of being told you're confused when you know you aren't, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not imagining it. Call the senior safety line at 1-866-299 1011. Contact your provincial adult protective services. Talk to your family doctor directly and privately, not through a family member who arranged the appointment. Keep notes with dates. Trust your instincts, because if something feels wrong, the feeling almost always knows something your politeness is trying to override. You spent your whole life building something. You are allowed to protect it. God put you on this earth to live with dignity, not to spend your final years being managed by people who've already decided what your life is worth to them. If this story reached you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to fr-sweetrevenge for more real stories like this one, because sometimes the truth that saves someone's life arrives just in time.